This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Well, there's been so much talk this offseason about Michigan's recent anemic record against its rivals. So how do the 2018 Wolverines stack up against those big three opponents? That's next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. Get it. Touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Greetings, Go Blue. I'm Steve Deace, and welcome to this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. Thanks to all of you tuning in here on YouTube or on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, etc. We appreciate you. Thank you very much for being a part of what we do each and every week during the season here on Michigan Podcast. Coming up a little bit later on, some Twitter poll results, the question of the week. Michael Spath of WTKA in Ann Arbor will stop by because we're going to break down last night's press avail, the only one we're going to get between now and game week. Some big headlines came out of there. We'll talk about those with Michael Spath later on in this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. But we begin with the tease. There's been so much talk this offseason, and rightfully so. I mean, let's face it. I know we just talked about Jimmy versus the world last week, but let's not also pretend we as fans aren't sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're tired of losing to our rivals. As the great prophet Allen Iverson once said, we're tired. All right, we're tired. Losing to Ohio State. We're tired of Sparty. Notre Dame's coming back on the schedule this year as well. So with so much focus this offseason on Michigan's recent anemic performances against its rivals, how do the 2018 Wolverines stack up? What are their chances of breaking the chain, ending this trend? Let's take this one by one. If we took the best players from both teams and forged a starting lineup, what would we come up with? Now, here's Michigan versus Notre Dame on offense. And one of the trends you're going to see is because of so much uncertainty in Michigan's offensive line, although the Big TN crew had rave reviews for Michigan's improvement up front. We're going to talk about that with Mr. Spath later on. You're going to see consistently that, the rivals that we're going to face just are more settled up there. So you look at Michigan and Notre Dame on the skill positions. I think Michigan has a concerted advantage at the skill positions with the losses Notre Dame has had beginning at quarterback with Shea Patterson. And people forget, Brandon Winbush got benched in the bowl game, and Ian Book actually came off the bench to win that game for Notre Dame. Now, there is some injury news here on the Notre Dame offensive line. Robert Haney, who's expected to be one of their starting tackles, has been banged up in camp. The plan was to move Tommy Kramer from tackle inside to guard, next to a newcomer there, Liam Eichenberg, to kind of, settle down both sides of that offense because they got to replace 2 top 10 draft picks at tackle. But Haney's injury has sort of, put the kibosh on that, and Kramer has had to play tackle. And, Sam Mustafar is a good player. I think Cesar Ruiz is a high ceiling player for Michigan. But still, you look at Alex Bars, there was a kid Michigan recruited prevalently a few years ago. This will not be nearly as good of an offensive line as what Notre Dame had last year, because the offensive line they had last year was filthy. But this is still going to be a pretty good unit overall. Now you look at the defense, and here's the other trend you're going to see a lot with our rivalry opponents. On the defensive side of the ball, last night Dave Revson of the Big Ten Network said Michigan's talent and depth on defense, and this was a quote, awe-inspiring. Well, even though Notre Dame's got a pretty good defense, they were top 25 in the country last year, 9 starters coming back. If we were putting together a starting lineup of the best players on this side of the ball on both teams, it's really not even a contest. In fact, Gilman, the safety I have starting there for Notre Dame, is actually a transfer from Navy that is going to start right away for them. Now, I actually think Notre Dame's got a good linebacker crew. I just don't think, they have guys better than Devin Bush and Khaleke Hudson, but this will be one of the better linebacker cores Michigan's going to face this year. But there you can see, that gives you an idea of really the top line talent Michigan is bringing to bear on the defensive side of the football, that they dominate a starting lineup with an opponent who was a top 25 defense last year and returns 9 starters. Now let's switch up to our next rivalry game here as we look at Michigan, how they stack up the Wolverines do against their rival. Let's go with Michigan and Michigan State. I think Shea Patterson has a higher ceiling than Brian Lewerke, but I think Brian Lewerke is a more established college player right now, so I'd give Michigan State the edge there at quarterback, which will upset some Michigan fans. Some Sparty fans are probably like Karan Higdon over L.J. Scott. Listen, L.J. Scott's career is really one great goal line run in a Big Ten championship game as a freshman, and then benchings, fumbles. I think he's one of the most overrated players heading into the Big Ten. There's no doubt, or heading into this in the Big Ten heading into the season. There's no doubt this guy has all-world ability, and maybe he'll put it together his final year, maybe. But so far we haven't seen it. And Karan Higdon, for the same reasons I have Brian Lewerke over Shea Patterson, is L.J. Scott a higher ceiling player than Karan Higdon? Yeah, but in terms of who I'm going to trust, toting the rock 20 times a game, am I going to trust L.J. Scott or Karan Higdon? Right now, I'm going to trust Karan Higdon. When you look at the rest of the offense, I like Michigan's wide receiver core a lot, but Felton Davis might be, other than Stanley Morgan Jr., the best receiver returning in the Big Ten. I think Cody White has just developed at a little bit of faster track than, say, Donovan Peoples-Jones has, mainly because he's had better quarterback play. Tariq Black. Zach Gentry's pretty much the tight end on all of these teams. I think Zach Gentry is going to have an absolutely monster year. And then Michigan State is doing some shuffling in the offensive line as well. I still think, like a reserve like a Luke Campbell. There you see I have him starting at tackle over, say, a guy like John Runyon Jr. They're kind of the same player in that they've both been kind of groomed to take over a starting tackle spot this year. But I just think with the body of work at what Michigan State's had on the offensive line the last few years compared to Michigan, I would give the edge there at a spot like that to the odds being higher that a Luke Campbell would be a higher quality starter than a John Runyon Jr. But you know what? If the hype we're hearing about Ed Warner and what has happened in Michigan's camp is anything close to real, and as Michigan fans, let's face it, we have certainly heard hype before. But if this hype is anywhere close to real, then I think that would really close the gap in terms of offensive line play between Michigan and Michigan State. No question about it. When you look at the defensive side of the football, again, this is another top 25 defense nationally, but just Michigan's talent is just overwhelming at some of the spots. I mean, I could argue that Lavert Hill and David Long are the 2 best corners returning in the country, depending on what metrics you look at, and they're in the same secondary. Michigan State has a fine linebacker core as well. But again, I mean, how many teams have one Khaleke Hudson, or one Devin Bush, let alone those two guys together. And, I know, Waleeks, there's a lot of hype about him for Michigan State. And, last year he was really good against the run. They didn't really have much of a pass rush, but there's no way you would put him on this team at defensive end over Chase Winovich, who led the Big Ten in tackles for loss last year, and Rashawn Gary. So again, another very solid defensive team for Michigan State, but the frontline talent at Michigan is by Michigan standards, really, it's historically good. Now, what about a team like Ohio State, which year in and year out has that kind of historically good talent in the Urban Meyer era? If we took the best players from the Buckeyes and the Wolverines, what would we get? Well, I'd take Shea Patterson at quarterback over Dwayne Haskins because, we saw one nice half in Ann Arbor, but that's the full body of work. We've had a season and a half of college football games from Shea Patterson. I think J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber, the backup, are both better than any tailbacks Michigan has. Both of these teams have very talented, deep receiver cores, just guys that don't put up a lot of huge numbers. So I'll give a slight edge to Ohio State with Paris Campbell and Johnny Dixon having more experience than, your Nico Collinses and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Zach Gentry was the tight end on all of these teams. And then, both of these teams' offensive lines are pretty similar, where they have a couple of spots where they feel really strong. I mean, when you have Michael Jordan and Isaiah Prince, Ohio State feels very strong there. Michigan feels very strong about Cesar Ruiz and Ben Bredesen. And then, like Michigan, where you're breaking in some new tackles, you're hoping a Juwan Bushell-Beatty steps up. That's what Ohio State is hoping for there with Thayer Munford as one of the starting tackles for them. Now you look at the defensive side of the ball, and here's where this was the biggest surprise to me. The defensive front for Ohio State going to be every bit as good as it was last year, but the linebackers, the defensive backs, a lot of youth there. This is going to be a very young back seven on defense. So, I think there's some guys that were big-time recruits for them that I think you will see step up and have huge years, but those guys just aren't as a stat like a Browning, for example, one of the star recruits from a couple of years ago. I think could be a very impact linebacker for Ohio State this year, but he just doesn't have the resume of a Devin Bush or a Khalil Hudson. So what does all of this mean? When you take a look at this, talent, if Michigan doesn't deliver against its rivals again this year, maybe this wasn't the case in the past, but this year, it's definitely the case. It's not going to be because there's a talent gap. Well, we get asked all the time here on Michigan Podcast by folks, hey, what can we do to help spread the word and support you guys more? Well, one of the big things you can do is support us on Patreon. Help us to cover the cost it takes to put this together each and every week here on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, etc. And as you can see, if you're watching us on YouTube here, we produce, even during the off-season, content exclusively for our Patreon supporters that we don't make available across our various platforms. For example, the more in-depth look at how Michigan's talent stacks up with its rivals that we just kind of touched on in the intro, you can see there, we released that with more analysis on our Patreon page for our Patreon supporters back on August the 4th, right? So we've also introduced a brand new tier, an exclusive booster club, $25 a month, and you get a chance to get all this kind of access to Michigan Podcast, as well as a shout out on the show, your name, business, if you'd like, in the credits. That's just $25 if you commit to that, to supporting us on Patreon, above the normal $5 pledge that several of you have already been very gracious to offer. So thank you for all the support you offer here on Michigan Podcast. Michigan Podcast at patreon.com. Back here on Michigan Podcast and joined by our weekly guest, Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to see you, Michael. Congratulations on that third hour. Thanks for joining us again this week here on Michigan Podcast.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. It's certainly been a lot of fun this week to be able to talk for an extra hour each day, and appreciate the great audience out there that helped make this possible. And certainly, friends like you, Steve, that have been contributing to the show and helping making it a little bit better every single time we go on.
Well, I'm a big fan of the show. Listen every day. And what I love about it is, like me, you don't like BS. You don't like being lied to. And you don't think the price of being a loyal fan is self-delusion. So I certainly appreciate that. That's why I would recommend it as a listen as well. Well, last night, Big Ten Network crew was in town making the tour of training camps, and they arrived in Ann Arbor. And so Michigan decided, let's kill every bird with one stone here and do really our only press avail the entire preseason camp until we get to game week. So we did get a few interesting nuggets that I have quelled from last night's gathering. We're going to look at a few of these and have you and I comment on them. This is from Nick Baumgartner of the Detroit Free Press, who was talking about, whether or not Michigan's going to get implicated in the shoe scandal at North Carolina. And Harbaugh says he doesn't anticipate anyone missing any time for selling shoes. Harbaugh mentioned all current players had to go through a shoe inventory. All shoes were present, he says, except for one number 52. And two guys wore that last year. Both of them are gone from the program. One because he's going to probably start in the NFL. The other because he was kicked off the team. So this was something that I know has been a worry of Michigan fans. Oh, no, we're going to get some guys suspended, this and that. What's your read on this news from Coach Harbaugh last night?
It's great news if it's 100% accurate, and there's no reason to believe it's not. We have been talking about this on our show on Monday, as if players were found to have sold their shoes for profit, regardless of whether or not you think the rule is stupid. The fact of the matter is it is an NCAA rule, and the players are aware of it. And as Harbaugh told the media yesterday, every time that these guys are given a new pair of shoes, they have to sign a waiver that essentially says, hey, we're not going to sell these things. We're not going to give them to family members to sell these things. If we do, our eligibility is in question. So it's certainly something where this was a black and white rule. And it's good to hear that at least from Harbaugh's perspective and from what Michigan's perspective they're telling us is that none of these players did it. Because I would hate to see that first game of the year, Michigan plays Notre Dame, and you've got 3 or 4 players suspended because of this shoe incident. I'm not even going to speculate because it doesn't sound like there was anybody that did it. But you'd hate to see that happen and impact the game over something like this, when down the street in Columbus they're dealing with domestic abuse, and in Maryland you've got a player that passed away from pretty much just disregard from the strength and conditioning staff when he was facing some difficulty. Those are the real issues that are facing college football right now. This isn't one of them. And I'm glad that we can put this behind us. One
of your co-hosts there on WTKA, Zach Smith, who does a great job reporting on the team for 24/7 Sports, I heard him say this morning that the rumor mill is that this may, though, involve men's basketball players. What are you hearing on that front?
Just what Zach said this morning. I haven't heard anything definitive. Honestly, he brought that up. We were on the radio. I haven't had a chance to check in with any of my sources yet. If it is, it would be unfortunate. I will only say this. If it's true, if the allegation is true, and there is a basketball player that has sold some of his Jordan-issued gear, the one thing that for basketball versus football is if you miss one football game, and that game's against Notre Dame in the opener,
right.
That is a huge detriment to your team. If you miss one basketball game or even 2 basketball games for Michigan basketball this year as some type of suspension, especially early on the season, that's not as significant of a miss as it would be for football. I don't want to diminish that because certainly, again, I said it's a black and white rule, and if he did it, he needs to be suspended. But it's not quite the impact that it would have had on the football team.
Let's move on and talk about one of the other bullet points that came out of last night. This is from Angelique Shengelis at the Detroit News. Quoting Harbaugh, quote, sooner rather than later, unquote, on when he will pick a starting quarterback. Sooner rather than later could mean a lot of things. The season's only 2.5 weeks away, right? So what's your read on this?
My read on it is, I think, honestly, the way that Harbaugh is so calculated and gives very little to the media, if he didn't think that there was someone that was emerging, I think he just would have said, hey, it's a competition, it's raging on. He did say those comments yesterday. It's competitive. This could go all the way up into the first game. Instead, he said he'd rather decide sooner rather than later. Maybe it's better for the team. Maybe this is one of those years where he can figure out my team needs a guy to rally around. My guys, I want to get my starting quarterback more reps so that he's ready to go in that first game against Notre Dame. So I think it's very likely, and from everything that we've been told, Shea Patterson has separated himself from the pack. I think if Harbaugh knows, and former players used to tell me this all the time, you can't lie. You can maybe fib to the media a little bit, but you can't lie to your team, and your team understands what's going on in practice. And so for Jim to step in front of his team in a week's time and say, hey, guys, the battle at quarterback is still going on, when everybody there sees that Shea Patterson's the best quarterback, sometimes it's better to say, hey, guys, here we are a week and a half away from first game. Shea Patterson has earned the starting job, and we're going to announce him as a starter internally. And everyone on the team goes, okay, good, because we know that. We've seen that, and it just kind of maybe helps the team out a little bit because then you're being honest with everybody.
So let me see if there's another aspect to Harbaugh's secrecy. Because my initial inclination, because I work full time in the media too, and so my initial inclination at this is to be annoyed. All right, like I have no idea what this is accomplishing. I don't know what it does, but if you try and see it from his point of view, and I think we could take a look at some of the controversies that have erupted with media and what he doesn't disclose over the last couple of years, and you look at him in reverse. You look at if indeed Shea Patterson is emerging. I mean, he's in almost every mock draft, first-round draft pick. Every day in the last 2 weeks, it seems there's been a national column about him. Pat Forty had a mention of him yesterday. I've listened to national shows say he could very well be the most important player in college football this season because if he is, he could transform Michigan the way Jarrett Stidham transformed Auburn a year ago, where they went from a 5-loss team to on the doorstep of the playoff going into the final week. You throw all those things in, all that hype. Your co-host again, Zach Smith, mentioned this morning, going back to the 24/7 rankings since 2000, he's the third highest quarterback recruit to come into this league in almost 20 years. Is it possible that this isn't skullduggery or an attempt to contrive a meritocracy? Pardon me, because my understanding is depth charts are posted at practice like every day. These guys know where they're at all the time. Is it possible this is about mitigating expectations for Shea Patterson? Because there will be an adjustment in a new offense. The opening game is against no slouch. Could that be what's going on here more than, something, some kind of, covert operation?
Gosh, Steve, it's an interesting theory. I'm going to have to disagree with it entirely. I just think that when it comes to Jim Harbaugh, his mentality when it comes to any of these position battles is, why would I give you anything that I don't have to give you? Mm-hmm. That's his approach to the media all the time is, I am not going to share any bit of information with you that I don't feel I need to. And he doesn't feel like he needs to share who is starting quarterback.
No, I didn't say I agreed with my theory. I just said I was going to posit one.
Well, it's possible. But I tell you what, Steve, I mean, you've listened to my show. We've had your Michigan podcast here and there, and now we're back to a regular full-time schedule. Have the expectations, have the talk about Shea Patterson not already been there?
Right.
I mean, we talked about it today. What is a reasonable expectation for Shea Patterson? I don't think if you're a head coach at the University of Michigan and you've got a 5-star quarterback that transferred into your program a year after your quarterback situation absolutely sucked, that you can mitigate expectations for that young man. The fact of the matter is that everybody's pinning their hopes on Shea Patterson being not the savior, not the second coming, but being one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten and one of the better quarterbacks in the country. And so does he gain anything by slowing the fans down from saying, well, we're not ready to name that quarterback? No, because all of us are hearing the same thing from all of our insiders, that he is a starting quarterback, so we're all dialing up the expectations anyway. So, no, I really think it comes down to this. Jim Harbaugh doesn't need to share. He's not going to share. He is never, in my career the last 3 years, I have never seen Jim Harbaugh volunteer information that he wasn't required or didn't need to give to the media.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I think he's doing better than last year, in his previous years, really, is, if you didn't start an interview off with him on the right note, the whole thing could just go off the rails, right? What I've seen this offseason, he just did it to the Big Ten Network crew. If you ask him that warm-up question where he previously might have given you an awkward stare or a weird answer, he's now using it as an opportunity to, in a very likable way, just stand there and filibuster. You know, I mean, he did this to the Big Ten Network crew in Chicago when they asked him about France. And these things are tightly scripted in terms of the timetable. And I think he spent 7.5 of the 12 minutes talking on that opening answer. And then last night when they made the mistake, you know, of just asking him generically, hey, what do you think about the new NCAA rules format? As soon as they asked that question, Michael, I knew he's not giving us anything in this interview because he is going to use that question as an opportunity to sit there and filibuster throughout the course of this interview, and that's exactly what he did.
I mean, Steve, for 3.5 years now, we've kind of learned that it's Jim Harbaugh's party, it's Jim Harbaugh's house, and we're just all here by invitation. And so if it's kind of like going to a little bit of a rock concert, and you have a certain like hope for what you're going to hear. But honestly, like they could play all their brand new music and you never get any of the favorites. And you're just kind of like, oh,
good analogy.
Great. I'm so glad I came to this.
Yeah. I
mean, he's in complete control. He's in complete control. The media is at his disposal. I mean, we have a job to do, but our job is predicated on what he says. And as I mentioned, I mean, it is bare bones. It is if I have to. If I have to speak up here for 5 minutes, I'm going to speak up here for 5 minutes. I'm not speaking up here for 5 minutes and 1 second. It's get in and get out and get back to coaching football because that's what he loves to do.
Two more things I want to ask you about from last night's practice. We mentioned the Big Ten Network. Dave Revson was pretty effusive in his praise last night, talking about a, quote, significantly better offensive line. Jerry DiNardo, a former All-American offensive lineman at Notre Dame back in the day, also said he thought it was a significantly improved offensive line. He thought their pad level was much improved. That's been a talking point amongst Michigan media with this offensive line for years. I think Doug Skeen is just going to start a website called padlevel.com because that's every podcast. He brings that up at the Wolverine, how bad their pad level is, and he's done that same show for years. I'm sure he's sick of it. We all are. So I thought it was good that DiNardo mentioned that. DiNardo even also said when he watched some of the one-on-one drills, as good as the Michigan defensive line was, he actually thought the Michigan offensive line more than held its own in those drills. So that talk from the BTN crew, and then Revson also said he thought Michigan's talent and depth on defense was, quote, awe-inspiring, unquote.
Yeah, I'll tell you on the offensive line, I'll say this. I remember BTN being at Michigan last year and the year before that and saying similar things. I don't put much stock in what Dave Revson and Jerry DiNardo are saying. I like Dave Revson a lot. I'm putting stock in what I'm hearing from my insiders, from Sam Webb's insiders, from Zach Shaw's insiders, from Chris Ballas's insiders. I think all of us have learned our lessons not to just blow smoke up the ass of the fans, because we've done in the past where guys have told us things and we've kind of put it out there and then they haven't lived up to those regards. Like they've been very poor along the offensive line. And so I think all of us, this whole, the Missouri State, the Show Me State, and all of us have kind of said, okay, we're going to be a little more critical. And I've talked to Chris and I've talked to Sam Webb and I've talked to my guy that's inside the program. And every single time I hear something positive, I say, okay, I want you to tell me like the realistic. I want you to to break this down and not just give me the hopeful fluff. And what I'm hearing over and over again, though, is there's actual reason for optimism. Ed Warner's come in and simplified things. Ed Warner's focused less on the individuals being 5 great individuals and instead on being one great unit. The young guys, James Hudson and Jalen Mayfield, are actually pushing Juwan Bushell-Beatty at that left tackle spot. John Runyon is kind of coming into his own a little bit. The interior of the offensive line, none of us are really worried about. But there's a great competition going on at that right guard spot between Spinellis and Michael Onwenu. And so I'm hearing a lot of positive things from people that I trust that are leading me to believe that while I'm still the Show Me State, I'm no longer at like 2%, 20%. I'm closer to like, okay, I think there's a 50% chance or better that this offensive line performs at a higher level this year.
Well, to me, how do you get worse? How do you get worse from the second worst offensive line in the Big Ten behind only Penn State in tackles for loss? How do you go? I mean, to me, you just improve by virtue of osmosis. Yeah, you can't get much worse than that.
I don't know. We've been saying that for 5 or 10 years now, Steve.
You're right. You're exactly right. All right, final talking point from last night's practice is going back to Nick Baumgartner from the Detroit Free Press. And this is Chris Evans, one of Michigan's co-starting running backs, talking about base personnel and offense, quote, more spread out a bit now, unquote. And that's been one of the hot debates, right, throughout the offseason. You don't bring Shea Patterson in here, who is more of an NFL prospect at quarterback than people I think understand. But you also didn't bring him in here to do fullback checkdowns. There's a certain style of offense that is more predicated on his success level, more of his wheeling and dealing. And I think you heard Chris Evans kind of let the cat out of the bag last night that you're going to see more of that this season.
I'll be very curious to see what they do with the offense this year, because you're right. I mean, with what they have at the slot receiver position and what they have with Chris Evans as a guy that you really need to get into space and give him an opportunity to make some plays with one guy, just a one-on-one tackler. With what they have at the outside skill positions, and then at the tight end spot, where they want to get multiple tight ends out there, but they have some really athletic tight ends in Nick Eubanks and in Zach Gentry and Mustafa Muhammad and even Sean McCune. And then, of course, what they have at the quarterback spot, a guy that's used to taking the ball out of the shotgun, a guy that can move around a little bit, a guy that can run the read option. This might be that nadir moment for Jim Harbaugh where he looks at the offense that he's run his entire career, this heavy pro-style offense, and says, you know what? I'm going to adapt. I'm going to change a little bit because of the way that the game is changing. And when he first came in here, do you remember in 2015 where we all kind of talked about, well, hey, he's going to run this pro-style offense, and the pros, NFL teams are going to be all excited about it, and this is going to give Michigan's skill players a chance to gain a leg up. But now when you look at the NFL, so many of them are moving towards the college level, and guys that are, quarterbacks like Baker Mayfield's the number one pick, and he played in a spread offense, and so many quarterbacks are doing it. So many offensive linemen are coming out of spread offenses, and they're going more into spread-type schemes in the NFL. So if Jim Harbaugh was kind of more original in 2015, now the pro style, the heavy 21 set is kind of outdated a little bit. And so how does Jim Harbaugh adapt to that? And if he does finally adapt with more spread out formations and running some read option and getting the guys in space, then I'll be impressed, because this is where the game is going. And if you look at his staff with Pep Hamilton, you look at his staff with Jim McElwain, this is the type of offenses. You look at Ed Warner, who was a coordinator at Ohio State. These are the offenses that those guys are most comfortable with.
Right.
The only person maybe not comfortable with it is Jim Harbaugh. But if he's as smart and as good of a coach as we think he is, he's going to be able to adapt to this fairly quickly.
I think you're going to see an offense. I think if you want to know what Michigan's offense is going to look like, go look at the San Francisco 49ers in 2012. I think it's going to look a lot like that. A lot like the Colin Kaepernick offense. That's what I think you're going to see a lot of. Michael, great stuff. Thanks for joining us, folks. You can listen anywhere in the country. He is on from 9 to noon Eastern time every morning there on WTKA in Ann Arbor, and it's available on iHeart, but I think it's also now on TuneIn as well, those apps,
TuneIn
both?
Radio, yep. TuneIn Radio also.
And then you can subscribe to the podcast there on iTunes as well if you can't catch it live. Michael, we always appreciate your work. Thanks for joining us this week on Michigan Podcast.
Hey, man, every time we talk, we're one day or 1 week closer to football season.
I'm excited. We need this. We do need that.
We do need that.
God bless. See you next week, man.
Thank you.
Coming soon. That's all I can say right now, but stay tuned. You're going to be seeing that logo more often here, and we'll tell you what it means soon. Back to wrap up things on this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. Here is this week's Twitter results. We asked you, true or false, Michigan's 2018 football schedule is too difficult to expect a national title run this season. And opinions on this are pretty much divided. 57% said false, but 43% said true. That's a little tease to next week's episode of Michigan Podcast, by the way. We're going to take a look at where Michigan's 2018 schedule stacks up historically with some of the more recent memorable seasons the Wolverines have had. So that's going to be one of the highlights on next week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Our question of the week comes from MPLS Kurt, who says, I've never understood the draw of Last Chance U on Netflix. What am I missing? Well, the first couple of seasons with the school in Mississippi, with the coach who at least was self-aware about his personal deficiencies, and the very likable academic advisor who kind of became a viral star, that was some great television. And you've seen several of those players make impact, on various college football teams around the country. This last season was a tough watch. I mean, it's if I have to hear a middle-aged white guy one more time with a cigar in his mouth, sitting alone in a hot tub in rural Kansas, say, "I'm a straight-up hustler," there's a lot of things I would do to myself that would all hurt, so I don't ever have to witness that again. There was a lot of unlikable players. It was a Chinese fire drill on the sidelines every single game. So if you like train wrecks, I would think you'd probably get those enough on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. But if you really like train wrecks, if you just can't get enough, so cable news doesn't feature enough train wrecks for you, this past season of Last Chance U is an 8-episode absolute train wreck. No doubt about it. Well, let's get to wrap it up for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. I want to thank our friends over at Detroit Sports Podcast for helping us get the word out about what we do here each and every week. And don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at Steve Deace Show, where we are constantly updating our opinions and thoughts there. You can subscribe to the podcast version on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play as well. Go Blue, and we will see you next week.